Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, colleagues, friends, please allow me first to speak English. I understand French, even un peu I speak French also. Frankly speaking, to say that I understand French and France, that is a very ambitious opinion. But first of all, I would like to say that I'm very honored to be here, to be invited here, and to address Jean Monnet Foundation, a leading international venue for debates on European integration and other major contemporary issues. Being here today, I should recall as a poll the name of my compatriot, late Professor Bronisław Geremek, who presided the foundation from 2006 until his tragical accidental death in 2008. Let me start my comments on Europe and Eastern neighborhood policy with a few general remarks on external dimension of the European Union policies. In historical perspective, the European project has been focused equally on internal integration agenda of the member states and at the same time being an outward-oriented, making an European idea and beacon of hope and inspiration for other nations. Jean Monnet never thought of the community as confined to the original 6 countries, as he stated in 1958, I quote, "Our community is neither a little Europe nor a closed community." The process of building an ever closer union had been accompanied by consecutive enlargements to the west, south, north, and finally to the east of Europe. It seemed relevant to remind Monnet's treatment of the European integration as the only solution for German unification, followed 14 years later by 2004 so-called big enlargement, which included Poland. Globalization made Europe more interconnected with the world as well as more vulnerable to external instabilities and conflicts. The enlargements and globalization have brought the European Union closer to its neighbors. One might say that the neighborhood has come to us, sometimes in a very brutal way. The European neighborhood policy was launched in 2004 to foster stability, security and prosperity in the countries closest to EU borders. The Eastern Partnership, as a part of European neighborhood policy established in 2009, had been designed to forge closer ties with 6 countries in Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus through trade agreements and democratic institution building. The Eastern Partnership ability to liberalize political and economic institutions in the region has fallen short of expectations. The events of recent years have demonstrated the need for a new approach. Europe is no longer the island of safety in a stormy sea. War in Syria pushed millions of people to flee their countries, many of them to Europe. ISIS and terrorism, conflicts in Iraq, Yemen and Libya, Russia aggression on Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, Europe's refugee crisis, still significant problems with economic growth, financial stability and unemployment in the Union, growth of populist and radical parties in the EU, prospects of Brexit, etc., etc., etc. External challenges make Europe's domestic problems much more difficult to fix. There is a lot of talk about a need to have the new EU global strategy on foreign and security policy. However, the European Union is under pressure to address first immediate short-term issues. Stabilizing the neighborhood is the most pressing need. The most pressing issues, in my opinion, are war in Syria, ISIS, refugees, and Russia-Ukrainian conflict. Addressing Eastern neighborhood policy, I will focus mostly on Ukrainian and Russia crisis because of its impact on the future of neighborhood policy and Europe's direct security interests. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and use of force in hybrid war against Ukraine marks a watershed in the European security policy. Ukraine is a key country for Russia. It's not just about the history and economic interest, but primarily about Russia's ambitions to rebuild imperial position. So-called Eurasian Union doesn't make a lot of sense without Ukraine. The post-Cold War European security architecture has been challenged and seriously damaged. Russia's policy became unpredictable and primarily shaped by frustration of elites and domestic public with unsuccessful transformation towards modern society and competitive economy, and decline of Russia's attractiveness even among its closest allies and partners. Russia hasn't changed its goal of ultimately bringing Ukraine under its control, but rather only changed tactics. The objective is to derail the process of Ukraine's approximation to EU and reforms based on European standards. Russia wants Ukraine to fail as a successful transformation would pose a challenge for Moscow by providing an alternative model of development in Eastern Europe and in the post-Soviet space in general. The European Union and the West in general is perceived by Russia as an adversary undermining its security interests and traditional values. One cannot escape an impression that the breakup of the European Union is a foreign policy goal for the Kremlin. Current internal problems of the European Union are perceived by Russia rather as an opportunity, not as a concern. Nationalistic forces in Russia gather strength and anti-Western sentiments. A mixture of frustration and economic hardship may make a dangerous cocktail, a dangerous mixture. The EU should act responsibly and with imagination. A key problem today is rather how to cope with Russia's weaknesses and complexes and not with Russia's growing strength and influence. This makes Europe's task very difficult, as simply negative instruments like sanctions and military steps alone are insufficient and with limited applicability. We need to engage Russia on addressing international problems, Ukraine included, in a collaborative spirit to reduce tension and reduce escalation. The Ukrainian crisis challenges Western governments and institutions in unprecedented ways. Most European governments fear an expanding conflicts within their continent and want to limit the damage from the while maintaining engagement with Moscow. Russia perceives a threat to its vital national interests from the West, but paradoxically pursues policies of increasing self-isolation. Ukraine, the victim of this drama, seeks to sustain its sovereignty and to reform its failed and corrupted institution, but not as a proxy battlefield between the West and Russia. Time doesn't play in favor of Russia or Ukraine. Continued economic crisis in Russia and a further decline of living standards, both of which appear to be inevitable this year, will erode position of President Putin. In Ukraine, reforms are no longer sufficient for improving the Ukrainian population's living standards. The country is much poorer. The dominant concerns are that corruption has not diminished and public services have not improved. A key to fix Ukrainian and Russian crisis requires a political solution going beyond the countries concerned. Minsk II, the agreement, means to facilitate it to stop bloody hostilities, but still there is no permanent foundation for peace in Donbass. Principal obstacles are political. There is the risk of having another frozen conflict destabilizing Ukraine and the whole region. Apparently, Minsk II needs some additional clarifications and guarantees for Ukraine as far as constitutional reform is concerned. Currently, Ukraine is under pressure of Russia. Lavrov in Munich, the Security Conference, said a constitutional reform is indispensable for Donbass to achieve its permanent status and must also lead to the appropriate legislation, and not just for 3 years, but on the permanent basis. Also, European Union said Ukraine has a deadline. They need to push those reforms now. They cannot wait. Ukraine, as a victim of Russian brutality and aggression, is facing a difficult decision to be taken in extremely complicated time. Regardless of all problems, Ukraine of today is a different country, more mature as a nation, ready to defend its sovereignty, and determined to make their country a modern, democratic, and economically efficient state. But there is still a long way to go. In spite of many setbacks, Ukraine accomplished quite many important economic reforms in 2015. Energy reform has greatly reduced price discrepancies and sharply limited state subsidies. The budget has been brought close to balance, and major international financing together with debt restructurings was accomplished. Ukraine has carried out a major fiscal adjustment, cutting public expenditures from 53% of GDP to 46% of GDP. The budget is more or less in balance on a cash basis. Tax reform has been adopted. The banking system is being cleaned up as more than 1/3 of the banks have been closed. After substantial devaluation, the exchange rate has stabilized. Electronic procurement has been widely introduced. Some regulation has occurred. The deep structural reforms required to comply with the acquis communautaire, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, represent enormous domestic costs and unpopularity. The critical shortcoming of Ukraine's current reforms is the absence of reforms in the judiciary system. The Prosecutor General's office needs to be cleaned up, and then the court should be reformed, which is a complex task. How complex, Pat Cox and myself, we know quite well after our long mission, but it's necessary to do it. Corruption is also a major structural problem of Ukraine, like in most of the Eastern Partnership countries. Reducing corruption is a top priority. According to Corruption Perception Index 2015 of Transparency International, among 168 countries assessed in the 2015, Moldova ranks 103rd place, Russia 119, and Ukraine 130th. The Ukrainian population see the lack of rule of law and the large-scale corruption of the political class as the problem number one. Recent scandal or recent crisis triggered by resignation of Mr. Abramovičius, the technocratic Minister of Economy, disclosing manipulations of oligarchs, could stop, even break the coalition in the parliament. Ukrainian media report that the major parties are preparing for a new parliamentary election in September. IMF press for a technocratic cabinet that will be free of pressure of oligarchs and corrupted politicians should be taken by the president and the government very seriously. Main European powers, also the United States, criticize Kiev because of the lack of these necessary reforms. The European Union has the responsibility to assist Ukraine economically and politically. At the same time, it should exert pressure when needed. However, the primary responsibility is on the side of Ukrainian authorities and people. There are evident limits of transformative power and the limits of European neighborhood policy transformative power. The future of this policy depends mostly on resolution of Russia-Ukrainian conflict. Going forward in Ukraine and Moldova, the trend lines are not encouraging. Among public opinion, faith in the transformative power of Europe is declining. Nevertheless, one should be patient, consistent and encouraging reform, convinced that assistance to the countries of Eastern Europe lies in the security and economic interest of the European Union and of all Europeans. I would like to end these introductory remarks with a quote from Robert Schuman, one of the founders of European integration. In 1963, Schuman had already argued, I quote, "We must build a united Europe, not only in the interest of the free nations, but also in order to be able to admit the people of Eastern Europe into this community if freed from the constraints under which they live, they want to join and to seek our moral support. End of the quote. Schumann's dream will not be fulfilled until the integration process embraces all willing European nations, including a satisfying, sustainable, and peaceful formula for cooperation also with Russia. This policy, in my opinion, is important, it's not easy, needs time, a lot of efforts and patience. I hope that despite all the problems which we can observe now, and we will keep the doors open for the countries from Eastern Europe and especially for Ukraine, because for our common interest is that these nations, these countries will share our values, will share our standards, and that is much better for all of us in sense of peace, in sense of security, and our common prosperity. Thank you very much.